Is another Flashback Sessions. It's been a minute, but we're back in here. My name is Uncommon NASA. On the other line is Short Fuse.
What's going on, everybody? It's good to be back.
We're going to get into basically the closing of Ozone as a studio and as a label, really functionally today. I said from the beginning that, it's Flashback Sessions. Not every single episode is going to be an exact session that happened. It might also, involve some different events that took place and things like that. For those that haven't seen us on the channel, really this particular podcast, vlog, whatever you want to call it, relates to a lot of the sessions that I did back in the day, whether at Def Jokes or early on Common or at Ozone Studios. A lot of the previous episodes we focused on Ozone, and we're going to do that again today, but we're going to start to move into the Def Jokes era, even though in the future, even though, we're not particularly doing this chronologically. I think it's kind of important to talk about the transition between Ozone and Jokes, and I know Fuse was interested in that weird gap of time too. I will say before we get started, subscribe to the channel, Uncommon Records NYC. We do videos like this, a variety of others. You can check the channel out. When we get to 1,000 followers, that's when we'll start talking about Colvane, Bazooka Fantastic Damage. I'm not going to do that until we get enough subscribers. I think we should bribe them.
Then we'll really see how badly they want us to talk about that stuff, which I know they
Exactly.
all do.
Yes. So
Now,
we're less than 100 away from that. So in reality, like, it shouldn't be that hard. But we got lots of other albums to talk about, a lot of other sessions to talk about, and today we're gonna get into Ozone. We already talked about Infesticons, which was recorded there. We talked about Patriotism, which was recorded there. Probably other projects as well. Mr. Lentz, Pity the Fool, we talked about, that was recorded there. So now, we'll kind of get into the studio itself and what that studio and label was like as a precursor to Jokes.
yeah, this would be cool because for as long as you and I have known each other, we've never really talked at length about ozone and how things like happen. Because I think a lot of people just think, ozone finished and then you went right to Jux. And I think, when people have talked about it in interviews, that can kind of be how it comes off too.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, so it'll be cool to discuss that gap and how everything transitioned. Um, what was the final day like there?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a big part of like talking about this is just it was it late 1999? No, it was mid 2000 actually. Toward the end of 2000, right? And that's when Ozone, um, decisions above me, of course, like, yeah, so I should start with the beginning. So, like, I might have mentioned this in a previous episode, but Ozone as a studio, as a management company, and as a label was sort of owned or at least managed by four different individuals. That was Amici, who is most known for being Company Flow and Run the Jewels' manager these days, but has done a lot of different ventures within the music business since then. At the time of Ozone, he was managing like concurrently like Saul Williams, Mike Ladd, Antipop, Mr. Lift, Company Flow, Sonic Sum, um, probably others as well. Certainly others. A lot of other people that ended up on releasing things on the Ozone label. Um, Vassos, who was the engineer that really taught me the ropes post schooling, was another part of it. A gentleman named Brett sort of did a lot of like the more pop sort of pop and rock or pop rock. It depends on kind of like your point of view. But it was sort of like the parts of Ozone that were intended to, get signed to major labels. And that was sort of his deal. and then there was Mark, who really did a lot of the web design, graphics, things like that. Early days of the internet, of course. So saying that, at a certain point, those four guys decided. I don't know the exact reason why. I can only imagine it's because money and things weren't working out or whatever. From what I understand, all four of them, I think they all attended University of Michigan together. They're not all from the Midwest. I don't even know if any of them are actually from the Midwest, but I know that they all went to U of M. And I believe that the story goes that they met there, and at least as I understood it, being, let's see, in 2000 I would have been 22. So at least 21-year-old me understood it that they all met um, at University of Michigan and decided to start this label and management company and move to New York and build a studio. So setting that up, eventually they decided to dissolve it, and it was a big education in music for me. Not just the last day, but like the entire like closeout of that.
Was the shutting down, was it gradual? Like, was it one of those things where like they tried to keep things quiet, or were they communicating things to people within the studio and things, just to keep everybody in the loop?
Oh, I mean, the thing that's important to remember is like a couple of people lived there. Brett lived there in his office. There was an artist who's still an active artist, a guy named Don DeLego, who actually played guitar on Pigeon along with this other guy named Steve Hamilton. And Don did a couple of other appearances. I think he played the guitar on he did, in fact, he played the guitar on Little Johnny on I think the song is called Be Aware on Little Johnny, but it later became Arise from Lift. And the Arise version doesn't have the guitar playing on it from what I remember, but the version that's on Little Johnny does. Anyway, so he lived there too. There was like this weird, like if you kept walking past a studio, there was like this back corner that had like this little storage room that like he turned into a bedroom. Yeah, that was interesting. So like, it's all young guys. I mean, I should set up the building itself too. But to answer your question first, to take it back and then go forward, like, yeah, I mean, because of the nature of the fact that people live there, Mark lived there too. So Mark and Brett lived there. Vassos didn't. Amici sometimes would crash, but I think usually he was out. At least by the time I was working there, and because they were there from like 90, I think they started in 96 or 97. Definitely by 97, they were there, and then I came in early 99, and I left mid to late 2000. Well, we all left mid to late 2000, but that was the end of it. So yeah, I mean, the nature of the fact that that a lot of people live there made it so that there was a gradual aspect to it. And coordinating the equipment, which we'll get into a little bit later too. Um, a lot of people had to know and needed to know, and our studio business, as it were, in terms of like out incoming clients that weren't part of Ozone management and weren't part of what would become Jux later. We had to slow it down and start turning work down and letting people know there wasn't going to be a studio there until X amount of time. So it was gradual, but a lot of it was saved for like the last week or so in terms of like the main move.
Was that just something that was happening, you know, concurrently with like, finishing off things that needed to be finished musically, before the studio was closed, and then at the same time tearing down equipment and moving it?
Ozone Studio was in downtown Manhattan. It was at an address called 62 Pearl Street. And if if you've heard like New York Telephone, I did a song called Pearl Street. And that's basically that song is sort of about like closing down Ozone. And I, being a Staten Islander, have a lot of familiarity with downtown Manhattan because that's kind of like the first area you get to see. when you go into the city because the ferry dock's right there. So when I was working there, I had already in my younger years than that even, I had worked as like a runner at the stock exchange. So I was familiar with downtown, and so it all was perfect. You know, it was like it was all meant to be. Like, you know, I told the story in the past about how I ended up getting the job at Ozone or the internship that became a basically a part-time job. Um, but yeah, the location was it was like, you know, exactly where I needed it to be at that time in my life. And so that being said, it's kind of a unique location for a studio because it's downtown financial district. And it was a third floor walk up. First floor was this just shows you how long ago this is. The first floor, some guy rented out like the little lobby. Like it was basically like almost like a brownstone, but like for commercial. Like so it was like a small little I mean it's still there, but like it's a small little space. And in the front entryway where like the super or whoever it was probably kept their shit, they rented out like a little bench to a guy that would shine shoes. So there was
Mm.
like a shoe shine guy in the front entrance. Then you would go up the stairs to the second floor. And when I was there was a couple living there. They just had dough or something. Because back then, if you were living in a space that large, I mean, you had to really have some money, even more so than today, I think, to some degree. But what I was told is the lore is that the second floor used to be sort of like a brothel, um, and they would just have like people like these random brokers and people from Wall Street would come and they would often like be asleep upstairs and people would come knocking on the door like looking for whatever random person that they were looking for. That stopped by the time I was there, but that was sort of the early days. At least that was the story I was told back then. Then the third floor was where Ozone was, and you would walk in. There was, you know, it was kind of like a I don't know if they call it like a railroad style kind of place. Like you'd walk in and then everything was kind of lined up to go straight. And so you'd walk in the front door and it was Amichi's office and Basos's office and then Brett's office and then Mark's office. And then you would walk down the hall past the kitchen on this side of you and then go straight down into the studio that was kind of like built. And if you went to the left from there, you'd be in the control room and then a mic room. And then across the hall from that was like a drum room where you could record like full bands. And then if you go further down around this weird cubby, that's where Don lived. And so that was the studio. That was what it was. And like shutting something like that down, you can see kind of how that was complicated. And you know, like I said, everybody kind of knew that it was happening. Some different issues between the four guys that I can't totally get into because I wouldn't even be the person to accurately tell that story because 20 years ago and it wasn't conversations I was involved in. It was just things that I had heard at the time. But I know that Vassos to this day is involved in finance and he left the music business and hasn't really looked back at all. And he was in the middle of he's really I say that because he's a really talented engineer. I guess he wanted to make real money, so he got his
Yeah.
Series 7. And when he got that, that was sort of like that was an inevitable thing at that point because he was a financial guy, not only was the engineer, but he was the accountant for the label. So I mean, for the studio and the label, like he paid the bills, and I'm assuming he wrote the rent checks and did all that stuff. So like when he left, it was, and I think Brett had his own ideas about what he wanted to do in the music business, and he had some other partners that he wanted to get down with, and you know, and that was kind of where it was. And so leading up to the end, you know, I had been working with company flow and you know obviously we talked about pity the fool so I did a whole record with Len. um and I had done patriotism, and I worked on all the early Canuck stuff, which was um Shirt Off the D and DPA single, which we also talked about on the show. But also Metal Gear got recorded there, Pigeon got recorded there. So I've been working with L a great bit, and I think L and Amici knew that my style at that time was pretty close to what Vassos was doing, and they wanted to continue that. And so they approached me. It's interesting. They must have really wanted me to do it because they approached me together in the hallway and presented the idea to me of if L bought all the equipment from Ozone that was needed and we moved it out to Brooklyn, like would I be down to basically work there, um, full time and do that every day. And of course, being 22 and not having any real responsibility, I said, of course, and went on that journey with Jux. And that's sort of how it got split up. And the reason I go back to like the education that I got from this entire experience is Ozone as a label put out 3 releases on CD before like the Jux deal, probably even before L and Koflo got signed to Ruckus. They did a CD called Vibology, a CD called Dime Bag, and a CD called Eargasms. And they had varied levels of success, I suppose. When the label first started, they were really into pushing and being part of like what was at the time called trip hop. And
Hmm.
trip hop, for the youngins listening now, I guess trip hop is sort of relatable to what people call lo-fi hip hop these days. It had a little more life to it than lo-fi hip hop does. It served more of a purpose than to be background music, but it was certainly fueled off of like we're gonna make hip hop or we're gonna make hip hop instrumentals, and that was what trip hop was. And they were really dedicated to that sound when they started. I think maybe that was what was going on when they were in college and they moved out to do that. And then as soon as they moved in, maybe things started going different directions as New York became New York. But I mentioned those CDs because we had thousands of those CDs. I mean, you remember well too from doing stuff with Shy Mill. Back then, if you wanted CDs, you had to press 1,000, or they're telling you get the fuck out.
Yeah.
Or and you know, most times, especially then in the physical era before the internet, people would press more than 1,000. They press 2,500, 3,000, whatever, just or even 5,000. I've heard of back then. We had stacks of CDs, and I remember we hired, Michi hired these junkers to come. And back then, like, maybe this still happens in New York, but like, junkers would literally just come with like just two dirty ass dudes would just be. I can still remember their faces. They were like two like middle aged white dudes, like with like what used to be like an old Hostess delivery truck or something, and they would just show up and you would just give them the garbage and they would take it to the dump or they would pick through it and keep what they wanted. And I just remember putting like boxes and boxes and stacks of CDs and vinyl into the back of this junker truck. And we ended up keeping a lot, and I can kind of get into the middle ground a little bit of what ended up happening. But I mean, it was sad because like when I was working at Ozone, like Vassos's office was sort of the longest office, and so it had like this big um, record shelf where all the back stock was kept, not just of Ozone releases, but also like we had like 25, 50 copies of like the Isolationists, with Vadim and Beans and Priest, and like just anybody that was managed, there would be stacks of their stuff. And like as the person that worked there, I would that was like the best. You would go back there and like I'd be able to grab something and take it home. And a lot of times as I worked there longer and longer, it was more and more me going in there to get stuff because my name was on it. And so it was a special
Right.
place, like, and shutting it down and watching all of those releases either get shoved onto a moving truck and for parts unknown, or you know shoved onto a junker's truck was pretty sad. Another thing that I'll mention is that another piece of lore of Ozone is, and this is a story straight from Vassos. First of all, I should say, like, all these guys were super young then. I mean, I was 22, but they were probably 25 or 26, I guess. And so I guess in the early days of moving in, like, Vassos got like super drunk. And this is before I was working there, but I saw it with my own eyes. There was a fire hydrant that he came upon drunk, and like had occasionally, like, the fire hydrant will just come off of the base of the sidewalk if the water pressure is such. Um, it does happen in New York, especially then. And so the fire hydrant was just laying there, and apparently he took this fire hydrant and carried it. I mean, if you ever seen a fire hydrant, you know how heavy these things are. He carried this fire hydrant up, well, downtown, wherever it was originally, up 3 flights of stairs, and just left it in a storage closet. And I don't know exactly what his plan was for the fire hydrant, but I do remember that was like the one thing that we didn't move out, that it just stayed in that closet and we pretended like nobody saw it because nobody was trying to take a fire hydrant down 3 flights of stairs. And they were big, it was three pretty big flights of stairs. But yeah, I mean, it was a sad time, like, I was lucky in the fact that I was invited to continue on to this Jokes thing. And at the time, that's all it was. Like, there was no like Def Jokes, or it was just an idea. It was a label being started by L and Amici. I don't know, maybe to some degree to prove a point, because it was after all the problems with Ruckus, and it was just what they were doing at the time. And I knew, I think I might have mentioned in other episodes, I knew what it was going to be because I remember sitting next to El at Ozone, and he was like putting together like his roster list to present to Caroline. I knew what I was getting into, and I was kind of secure in that. And so that helped me. But, you know, there were other parts of the four that, like, their journeys were less secure and they were less young, and, you know, needed to figure things out. And so I just remember, like, the last night, it was kind of sad because all four of them weren't even there. And, like, the folks that were there kind of like didn't speak very much. And it was icy, it was cold, it was weird. And I don't know how else to say it. Just, it is what it was. It was what it was. I mean, hard decisions need to be made, and they're not going to be made and understood by everybody. Now, as a person that's 44, I understand that, but at the time, I don't think everybody understood that. And
Well, it's probably jarring because you guys are a collective for a number of years, and then all of a sudden it's over. Um, Probably rather abruptly too, in
it was.
hindsight. And then like you said, with loading all these records and CDs into the back of some random truck, and you don't know where they're going. We talked about this a few times, on air and off air, but like when you're in the moment, you don't realize you're throwing away, pieces of history
Right.
because those things aren't going to be, we've come to understand that a lot of things don't get repressed, especially when it comes to indie hip hop. And things, a lot of things don't end up on streaming services. So if you're one of the few lucky ones to have things, from that era, and you have an essential gold mine,
I
because
mean, yeah, I mean, speaking of those three records in particular, which are probably not digitally available, you know, Dimebag had like an original, like the first LP beat, just after Juvenile Techniques was released. it had a song called World of Garbage that was like a beat of his on this trip hop CD. That if you have it, you have one of the first appearances of LP as a producer. If you, if you don't, you don't. And Eargasms was a really, of the three, was probably the standout. I mean, Eargasms was um all of the, well, most of the folks in the poetry scene in New York doing an album, and it was a great record. I mean,
Yeah, of
it
those
was a
three
who's
that you
who of the poetry scene at that time.
of those three that you mentioned, I do remember Eargasm. And I don't actually I don't remember the other two. I'm gonna have to look those up and dig into those.
Yeah, and it's wild, man. I was looking up some other unrelated material from that Ozone era, and man, a lot of that stuff stuff is not as available as you think it is. And like I just ordered something recently um from that time period from Huge Voodoo, which was Mr. Bruce's project, that I looked everywhere, and like you can't get this unless you buy that CD or the 7 inch of the other piece of it. So we'll get into some Huge Voodoo stuff at some point on this channel. But in any case, yeah, I mean, it was a pretty tense time. We had a lot of fun. I've told this story probably off air a lot more than on air, but like, you know, I have like a lot of really cool memories of the Ozone times because we were all so young, and like Brett kind of Brett was kind of the spender amongst all of us for whatever reason, and like he was like the first guy. He might have been the first guy I knew that wasn't like a stockbroker that had a cell phone. And like it was so early in cell phones that I remember people would constantly fuck with him and tell him he was going to get like ear cancer. Um, and he legitimately believed it, and maybe it was true. I mean, a cell phone in 1999, I don't know what the fuck that shit was made of, but I can remember when Dreamcast came out, you couldn't get that shit anywhere. Sega Dreamcast for the youngins here, but and we got in the car, me and Brett. I was the only one around that day for some reason, and there was no session. It's like me and Brett went in the car and drove into Jersey Gardens through the Holland Tunnel and got this Dreamcast. And after that, like Soul Calibur and NFL 2K, like just basically never came off of that fucking Dreamcast. And the tournaments of NFL 2K between me, Don DeLego, Mark, and Rob Sonic are still pretty legendary, I would say. And they're just fond memories for me, man. Like I really am not a huge video game guy. At the time I probably was a little bit more. Um but even then, like that was sort of a revival for me, even at 22, because I'd kind of been in and out of playing games. But just all those memories, man, and just like that, it was over, And but at the same time, like when I look back on it, it's like, well, we were lucky that we had that time period when we did, and now as an adult, I look back and I'm like, well, how could that have not ended? Like what other conclusion was going to come to the
Right.
situation that I've just spent the first, bit of this episode describing? What else could have possibly happened outside of like, somebody getting signed to a major and getting a huge bonus, that whatever, and that happened. Like people did get signed, like Don DeLego got signed, Bree Sharp got signed, Mike Ladd got signed, Antipop got signed to an indie. um Obviously Company Flow had to deal with Ruckus at one point, so people were getting signed, and I assume that through Ozone Management was getting some kind of percentage, or else what would their business model be? So there was money coming in, I guess, at different points. I don't want to sound like a hippie commune, but it also was a bit untenable because of the way that the music was going. The music business was going. As Ozone shut down before the widespread advent of illegal downloading, but it was right around the same time as that took off. Ozone went down, and I
Right.
don't think anyone would directly blame that but it's part of it. Like the overall industry was shrinking, and so like when you have a smaller industry the idea of like an indie label or an indie startup management company like getting tied into like a larger system and then growing, all of that goes away. You've destroyed the entire infrastructure of the music business, and so things like this can't happen. Like I can do stuff here, you know, as an indie label owner, as a semi manager, as a promoter, I could do all that stuff independently in 2023. But this is, in spite of this being a studio behind me, this is my home. Like I live here. Like I don't have a staff. I don't have like four people down the hall in an office working on graphics nine to five, working on promo 9 to 5, working on the accounting 9 to 5. That was what Ozone was, and it was one of the last of its kind. But during that time period, it was very commonplace to go from Ozone, or in the early days, go from Jux to some other indie label office in downtown Manhattan or in Brooklyn and have a party there, or have a get together there, or have a meeting there. And
Right.
that was at that time, you know.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say that in regards to it not being a sustainable model, I just think that's a product of a byproduct of youth. I mean, because when you get into a situation like that when you're young, you just think, this is a never ending, you know,
Mm-hmm.
influx of, whatever it is, whether it be time, money, projects, you know, uh shows, whatever it is. You just think it's just once you get to a certain point, you're like, oh, this is it. This is going to keep going, and this is just what it is. So I can definitely, especially for a collective like that. I mean, you're just constantly surrounded by amazing levels of talent. You know that just went on to do obviously legendary things within the scene. So I can imagine being a younger person. You're just like, well, how the fuck is this falling apart type thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, the security net of knowing that I was going to go to Jux without even knowing fully what that was going to be, but at least I had somewhere to go. I knew that I wasn't going to have to go back to interning at some big studio and make coffee again. Like
Yeah,
I
because
knew that like that wasn't the case.
the crazy you mentioned Bassos. The crazy thing about Bassos is like after Ozone was done, it's like that was it. Those if you look up his credits after Ozone, that was it. Like he just basically
He was like the child actor that quit. Like he just disappeared from it. And that was his choice. Like when I knew Vassos, tell some Vassos stories. I remember we had to leave the studio and go up to John Hancock's studio. So shout out to John Hancock, Ken Heitmuller. They were the guys who mastered a lot of Ozone and Def Jux's records later, early Uncommon Records stuff as well. And they had a place called Independence Productions, which was up on Orchard Street, and we had to go up to the session to hang out as they mastered Welcome to the After Future for Mike Ladd. So we're going up there, and he had a Harley at the time, and like, it was always like he was always a bit of like a paradox. He was a very like, I don't know, by appearances, he's kind of like a straight laced kind of guy, but he worked on this indie rap music, but he also like was taking his Series 7 and getting ready to get married, but he also had a Harley and like would driving around the city, and like it was really like he was an interesting cat, man. And like, so I'm young enough to be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna get on this motorcycle. Because he was young enough to invite me to get on the motorcycle to go uptown. Um and I kind of like went through the motions of being about to get into like the back seat of this motorcycle, and I was like, wait, so the only thing that's keeping me on this thing is me like holding onto your back as tightly as possible. He was like, yeah. I was like, you know what, I'm gonna take the subway, I'll meet you up there. But I don't know, I was like that young, you know what I mean? And like I just could picture myself holding, I mean, you don't really know how fast a motorcycle goes until you get on one, which I've still never done. as a rider or as a driver. But that was the kind of vibe, man. That was what it was, you know, like it was young people doing fairly dumb shit, I guess. And eventually I kind of mentioned that story too because I knew there was a phase where he sold the bike, you know, and like that was a big part of his what he perceived at the time of his growing up period, you know what I mean? And like and look at like again, like I'm an adult now, so I get it. I understand it. You know, it is what it is. But yeah, his credits for mixing definitely just basically ceased. He worked for a short time um doing some mastering himself in another place, um but that was like a couple of months and after that that was it, you know. Um
Obviously, it worked out for you because you got to transition on the Def Jokes.
yeah.
Do you think if Vassos was, and you may not be able to answer this,
Mhm.
may just be, best guess scenario, but do you think if Vassos would have wanted to continue, well, let me backtrack. Was he vocal about leaving the music business at a point, and that's maybe why L didn't ask him to join Def Jux, or was it just a thing where they felt that you were a better fit, or was there a scenario where they could have taken both of you if that was possible?
um I think a little bit of all of that. I think, you know, again, like Vassos was a couple years older than me, and he may have been a year or so older than L. Like he Vassos had kind of in an engineering way had kind of mentored L a little bit because, you know, they both I think they both told me the different sides of the story of like where there were points where L would come in and you know he's at the time he was a very heavily sample based producer and he would sample a lot of like really rough and rugged records, you know, that had vinyl noise and we all like vinyl noise but there's a certain limit to it that you can get away with. And you know Vassos like was like yo you need to get some CDs and you know sample higher quality stuff and it changed L's sound a little bit and I think they respected each other because of that, you know. And so I think they would have been happy to have had Vassos keep working on the records and have me continuing to be the recording engineer and sometimes mixer and maybe eventually I would have taken over, you know, his role if he wanted to just go to another recording studio or to go someplace to make more money or whatever. But he was also sort of like I said, like segueing himself out of the music business. He wanted to um I think get married and start a family and start making real money and doing whatever he did. I mean, you know, beyond that, you know, we'd have to ask him. But, you know, but I think in terms of like Jux, you know, had Ozone not broken up, I think Jux would have continued. Jux would have happened anyway. It's not like one replaced the other. I think
Right.
that's an important thing to clarify. They and in fact we can get into it a little bit, but like they actually ran parallel to each other for about a year or so. As labels anyway. And so, you know, I think Jux would have certainly happened had Ozone continued. It probably would have happened at Ozone instead of in Brooklyn at L's house. And I think I would have still been very much a big part of it. Maybe even mixing all the records that I did mix as Vassos kind of stepped back and maybe he would have done more accounting or maybe he would have, you know, only done some of the, you know, higher end like outbound or inbound clients or, you know, who knows how it would have evolved over time. But I was being groomed. I should say I said that because now I'm getting a memory of this now. I was being groomed to replace Vassos regardless because Vassos's whole thing was that he wanted to just go straight into the accounting and occasionally do some engineering. He didn't want to be in the studio all night, all the time, every night, responsible for that source of income on his own. And so that's part of why they went out and got an intern, which was me, and then why I became the assistant, and then why I became the recording engineer before I left. I mean, I recorded almost everything that came through there for the last year or so that I was there, at least 9 months. Like he didn't record that much at all. He was up in the front and legitimately doing accounting that I guess was extensive because again, like these days you'd be like, oh, I don't know, maybe the guy's not him, but like, if you're at a workplace, you might be like, yeah, yeah, the boss is up in his office fucking off. But like, it's not like there was internet then. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like you're just sitting on Twitter or Facebook or like, Google or something. Like back then, like if you were in an office and you weren't doing the work and you didn't have a TV in that office, like you were doing something, So I don't know what he had on his plate. Maybe he was doing a lot of studying for his Series 7 at the same time, but I was brought in to replace him in the room. He still oversaw my work and would come in and check in and make sure that I was doing things correctly when I was mixing or recording. But yeah, so I think that's kind of the full answer to that question. I think jokes would have happened anyway. I think I would have still been involved in it anyway. It just would have happened at a different place and maybe a slightly different timing. But they definitely loved the work that he did too. They yeah.
Well, I mean, it makes sense because I mean, he taught you what you know, and you carried that forward and put your own spin on it. So, I mean,
Hmm.
it's, I mean, you probably your style of mixing probably wouldn't have happened without him. I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I think he taught me to be creative with mixing. And maybe I would have been that kind of person anyway, but I wouldn't have had an example like to point to, and it would have just been me like finding my own way. Whereas like working with him, he taught me that you could phase stuff and you could pan stuff and you could put reverbs, you could send something to a reverb and bring it back and only have the reverb primarily in the mix. And like just all those kinds of like really like more trippy, like kind of creative tricks. He taught me the basics too. He taught me how to do like, subtractive EQ on vocals, and that completely gave me a career. Like mixing rap without doing subtractive EQ is like sticking a pin in your ears. I mean, it's horrible. It's just someone yelling at you. So like, he taught me a lot, and then like I said, I mean, like we've said, I should say, like I did take it to a different step, and I got more reps. Ultimately, by the time I left Jooks, I probably got more reps behind the board than he ever had. So
Yeah, which is crazy because it's when you think about this time frame, again, when you're a young person, you feel like it's a long time, but then when you get older and you look back at it, you're like, oh, that was only like, 5,
yeah,
6 years. And that's, even Def Jux, when you look at it, didn't last,
I know.
as long as, our younger selves sometimes might have thought, so it's pretty crazy that these things happened in such a short window and made such an impact.
Yeah, I
You know.
don't know exactly when Jooks officially shut down, because for me it ended when I left. I was like, what was I gonna do? Like I had to go and get my own career going someplace else. And again, like hindsight 50 or whatever they call it, 2020.
2020, yeah.
Hindsight 2020. I kind of understand, what happened there too, and just decisions had to be made, and nobody wanted to, you know. I mean, we'll get into the end of my Jooks time too someday on Flashback Sessions, but it is what it is. I get it now as an adult, but I was there from the end of 2000 until the somewhere around 2005 ish, somewhere around there. So
Because
yeah,
when again when people think about and even with hearing people talk about it in other interviews because I've heard El touch on the start of Jooks and things like that. So it's sound he made it sound like, and you've kind of confirmed it, that there was a plan in place for a long time that this was going to happen regardless of what was going to happen with Ozone. And if Ozone had stayed open, it would have been more of like a partnership, home base type thing for the label
mm-hmm.
versus oh shit, this thing's shutting down. We got to get the fuck out of here and figure out what's next. So
Yeah. I mean, that was the time, though. Like it was. Jooks had their own office that moved around a little bit in terms of like the label management, product management part of the business, but you know Ozone was a central location. It was like a real recording studio. I mean, it wasn't
yeah,
like it wasn't as big as like going to Green Street or something, which we later did, but it was a for the artists we had, it was a pretty big deal spot, and it was located conveniently, at least for me and for most people coming in from Brooklyn. Even if you're coming from uptown, I mean, at least you're already a straight shot down, on the subway. You could take the express and you're all the way down in downtown Manhattan. So it was pretty conveniently located and centrally located. People don't realize how centrally located downtown Manhattan is. And, like to this day, like people that aren't from, frankly, that aren't from New York originally, but that aren't like from like from here, like downtown Manhattan is like this isolated place that nobody ever goes unless you have a reason to. But if you have a reason to, it's actually pretty centrally located.
No, I can say
Um,
that
you know,
as a traveler that's, before the pandemic, I mean, I'd come see you every year
hmm
to hang out and work on music stuff, and um that that part of the trip was the easiest to navigate because
yeah,
everything was connected. Um
yeah. And so that's the thing. Like, it would have been a hub, and it was a hub. I mean, to some degree, like, it's important to remember too, like Ozone was a label, it was a management company. So like Ozone management would have continued to be L's manager, i.e. Amici, and that is still true today. It's just Amici doesn't call his business Ozone management anymore because that was a partnership with other people that aren't in the loop with him anymore, I presume.
right.
So, I don't know if he has a name for his company these days or not, but like, that was what it was. And so that's continued, and I think ultimately a lot of the vibes like shifted out to L's, like as we kept it moving. A lot of the same people were part of Jokes that were part of Ozone. I was still recording L obviously, but I was recording Ken Ox and I was recording Liff and I was recording, Camus and like a lot of the same people that had at least been hanging out at Ozone, if not recording there, were then recording at Jux.
Now some of the stuff that came out on Ozone, because Ozone, when did Ozone officially shut down?
So the studio shut down. The studio and the business as the partnership that it was shut down sometime. I was doing the math on this the other day when I was getting ready for this. It shut down sometime in the fall of 2000,
See,
August,
because
maybe September, something
that's
like that.
interesting. That's interesting because I was looking at um, some of the Ozone releases, and there's stuff that came out in 2000 and 2002
Right.
officially.
Right, because
Um,
the Ozone label remained. And so that's what I was saying about how the two labels coexisted for a while. There was a shared office at one point. So like that was the advent of what we now would call WeWorks. And so like WeWork obviously didn't exist as a company then, and for some reason they felt like they invented the co-working office. But co-working offices for independent businesses like this existed back in the late 90s and the 2000s. And the original office that Jesse worked out of. So, shout out to Jesse Ferguson, who was the product manager for Jokes and probably worked a bit for Ozone as a label as well. He had gotten involved with Jokes and with Ozone because, if I remember right, the first time I ever met Jesse, he had a company with this other guy. I think it was called like Gorilla Promotions or something, like before everyone that did that kind of stuff called it guerrilla marketing. But like um they had this spot on Orchard Street as well. Orchard Street was like a hotbed of like activity with like indie music and just companies around it. Because Independence that I mentioned before, the mastering spot that we all used was up there too. But they had a business together where it was literally just an entire business built on getting kids to come in and put stickers on stuff in public because there was no internet. And so it was guerrilla marketing for real. It wasn't like viral marketing. It was like actually
Right.
like, and that was a business then. And again, this is kind of, I'll beat the drum again, but like, when you have a successful and large music business, you can point to like everything that's wrong with that and the inequities, or you could also point to the fact that like all these like small bespoke like garden industries can kind of live around that the largeness of the music industry. But the world changes and things change, so it is what it is. And so I mentioned that because a lot of the CDs that I talked about that got stored, like they had a basement, like a really dingy basement in their spot on Orchard Street. And I can remember um, how you bring up the gate on the sidewalk and like,
Yeah.
then there's the stairs and all that shit. And so like we had all of these CDs and vinyl, and we're like had like push carts, and we're taking them down the stairs. And I remember like Rob Sonic came out to help, and so it was me and Rob and Amici, maybe some other people were there. I don't remember. And we're putting stuff in Jesse's basement, and this basement had not seen anything in it besides like a hot water heater and rats for probably like 10 or 12 years. And I just remember Rob coming up the stairs, looking at Michi and going like, "Doesn't feel good to put my stuff down here, man. Like, I
Yeah.
hope there's a plan." And so I don't know where all that stuff went or whether it ever made it out of that fucking basement. But, for the most part, they were pretty good about, through the Jukes years, they were pretty good about protecting product because I'll give them credit. And this is something we could talk about on another episode in more depth. But like, I remember getting a call years after I wasn't working for Jooks from Jesse, and he was like, "Yo, I've got like X amount of woke 12 inches still here," which was the President's 12 inch that came out on Jooks. Like, do you want us to trash them or do you want us to send it to you? And I was like, "Shit, send it to me." And I got them, and I could talk about what happened to them later. But yeah, so they were always good about inventory. So I'm assuming based on that interaction with me personally that that stuff made it out of that basement, but it did not feel good going down into a cobwebby, like dank basement with all this like really dope music. But that was sort of some of the endings for this. And I think we were talking about Ozone and Jux. The Ozone label continued in that co-working office. By this time now, fast forward, I mean, again, like you were saying, everything feels like it's forever, but it's actually happening in months' time. By the end of that year, I think Jesse had left or dissolved the guerrilla marketing thing and then came on. And he was also running his own label with another guy, the Embedded Studios label that put out a couple of different releases that people, older heads probably remember. But he was working for Meech at that time, and it was just like a desk around a corner with like a movable wall, and there was just stacks of vinyl. And I can remember when Purple Pigeons came out from Saul with that jam on the B side that had Orko on it.
Yeah, that's
Um,
one of the that was one of the releases that came out um
mhm.
after.
But yeah, that was those were organized, and Amici was still doing his own thing. He already, I guess he had made some obligations, but wanted to continue doing the label for a little while. And then once Jooks got to the level that we all know, he just gave up on. I don't know why exactly. I'm assuming he just needed to spend more time working on Jooks, but um, I don't remember even because I was there when Ozone stopped putting out Ozone records, but I don't remember ever having a conversation like, yeah, Michi decided not to do that or anything like that. It just it be I think at a certain point it became a little bit of an overlap, and I think a lot of people left Amici as a manager at that point. And so it just I guess it didn't make any sense anymore to do
Yeah,
it.
because I know the Opus around that time they were doing their own thing, and a lot of people don't realize how much the Chicago scene and the New York indie scene are connected, like legitimately. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
back then, I mean, they had Aesop and other people were on Opus releases, and Chocolate Industries was a big connector of the two scenes too. So it's interesting how
Yeah, I
that just
mean,
happened organically like that.
Chocolate Industries and the dude that ran that was a guy named Seven, and like, um, he was down with Amici working with him back in the Ozone studio days. Like, I remember him putting out releases like the Prefuse release with Liff and Dell. That was a big single, and that like kind of put Prefuse 73 on the map. And that was a big deal at the time, and I think Amici was somewhat involved in making that happen. Um, and went on to later times like the Deadlight single, you know, things like that like came through Chocolate Industries, and then um, yeah, I mean Ozone put out the all four singles and Opus singles, and yeah, it was definitely connections there.
Yeah, because Plaster Man came out in 2002, and that was like one of the last releases for Ozone, I think.
Yeah, I mean I can remember I took a quick look at the Discogs yesterday. I'm actually gonna open it up here and go through it. Not not everything through it, but just don't worry. You don't have to fast forward your video if you're watching at home here. But yeah, I mean, Youngblood Brass Band was, kind of a precursor for what Budos Band, would find following from. They were from the Youngblood was from the Midwest. They had a pretty successful single with Quali back in the day, and Sonic Sum. Yeah, Plaster Man was one of the last CDs, the CP. I remember that. Parts of that ended up on films, I think.
Yeah,
Opus and Thought for, like I said, like this Where Thought is Worship single was fucking dope. The First Contact CD from Opus was awesome. Had that really dope Lumbus solo song on it. Yeah, Activator Cowboy was sick from Lad. Ultra Living. This single, if you haven't gotten this, if you're listening, like the Ultra Living featuring Mike Ladd, that single is dope. I remember bumping that all the time. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of stuff, like you can go on and on. I mean, then you start to get into some of the stuff that he managed. But I remember, I think I recorded this Chromosomes Project record. Um, there's a ton of stuff on here. The Von Meister single, that was one of my first credits. I don't even really know where or who Von Meister was, but he came through the studio because Michi was fucking with his producer, and then they got Sadat X on a track, and I got to record and meet Sadat X when I was probably like 22, and Sadat was probably still not even 30 yet, I would think at that time. Maybe he was around 30, but crazy. So yeah, there's a lot of legacy to Ozone's releases too. Um, I didn't record every single thing that Ozone put out, even though I worked in Ozone's studio, as ironic or whatever that might be. But yeah, but the label definitely coexisted, and I guess kind of leads us to like that middle period in between Ozone and Jux.
well, now that I kind of had the gaps filled in, it seems like for the most part, as smooth as you can, it seemed like it was a smooth transition from one thing to the next. Um,
Yeah, I
which
mean, I think
is
the only person that was really affected by the transition mostly was Abici. I mean, he had to transition from manager of many to manager of few, and then manager of somebody, co-owning a record label with somebody. That was probably a transition for him. But I think as a manager, I think I'm not going to speak for him, but I would think that at the time his mindset was in managing all these different people that the natural evolution was going to be that one or two or three of these people are going to hit in a major way. In the meantime, I'm going to support, this positive music. But obviously, it's a natural progression that if one thing particularly hits, that you're going to dedicate the rest of your time to that. And that became L. So
yeah, makes sense.
Ozone shut down in the fall of 2000. And then I didn't do my first sessions for Jux until December of 2000. And I did like probably like Five on Fossils and Hold the Floor, and a couple of those singles were like really early on.
Obviously, we talked about, the transition period and how it seemed like back then a longer time than it really was. What did you want to do in between while
Yeah,
you were waiting?
it was like it was a like we said a couple of times, man. Like time is so slow at that point in your life when you're a young person. Um, but looking back and putting the timeline together in my head, it was only about 3 months in between. And that was the thing, like it was a leap of faith for me. I was still living at home. I wasn't living at home for much longer than this, but I had the ability to be like, okay, I can wait, for like 3 months for jokes to start. But yeah, in between I got called. Um, I don't remember if I got paid for this or not. It doesn't really matter. But I remember being called in, and like there was someone that regularly would go with like Ozone acts, either for tours to sort of be a semi-tour manager or for special events or whatever to kind of be there. And that person either flaked or just wasn't able to do it. And Amici called me and was like, "Hey, Company Flow is going to play patriotism for the Ralph Nader campaign, and it's going to be at the Garden. Can you go and just be there to kind of guide them through the process of just getting in the building?" And he gave me whatever information I needed. And me, keep in mind, I'm 22 and I'm like walking these guys around, and like I don't remember if Amici ended up there at some point in the night or if I just needed to be there to get them in. I don't remember, but I remember, yeah, it was Madison Square Garden. I'm in the bowels of Madison Square Garden with L. Vast, who was there to do ad libs on stage, and Len, who was DJing. So Company Flow was still together in terms of L and Len. Just had left, maybe a year before that, if not longer. And yeah, I mean, we're walking around hobnobbing with like Eddie Vedder and like, you know, Tom York. Like after they got off the stage, I'll never forget this, like because everybody lit up when this shit happened. Because we were fucking, who the fuck were we? Who were they even? Like this is 2000, this is pre Cold Vein being released. And it was certainly pre Fantastic Damage being released. And it was just off the strength of Company Flow as a name, off of all the press that Funk Crusher Plus got, and then everything that came after that. And somehow, that's an Amici question, like how this came together. But yeah, I mean, I can remember, and they got off the stage. I'll get into the performance itself, but like they got off the stage, and Tom York is just walking by, and he just looks up with his face that everybody knows, and his accent that is obviously very heavy British that I can't replicate. But he was like, he saw L and Len and was like, Company Flow, I love you guys. And they just like walked off, and like and it just lit everybody up, like Vast too, and like everybody was like, wow, that was fucking Tom York that knew exactly who all these guys were. And that was really special. And like I think that he I think that L went in the back and like talked to those guys a little bit more. I think maybe that eventually is what led to him um getting to know like Trent Reznor a bit more, because Reznor was sort of a fan of his work too. At the time, how they ended up working together on a few things here and there. But yeah, I mean, to my mind, I mean, I don't know, some of those guys like Company Flow probably did some festivals and some other bigger shows where they interacted with some pretty big names. But to my mind, I think that was probably the first like genuine interaction that L and Company Flow and Def Jokes as a whole had with like a so worldwide celebrity name, where it was like, oh wow, like this is real. Like, people like Tom York and Trent Reznor and Eddie Vedder know who they are. Like, and it was pretty amazing for me to see, and be inspired by, this is what I came up around. Like for a long time, I thought to myself, like, maybe I'm expecting too much of this music shit. And to some degree, I guess I was, but what else did I know? You know what I mean? Like, I
Right.
was very lucky to be at the center of these situations where, boom, like I'm at Madison Square Garden, and like Tom York is walking by, shouting out the guy that I'm working for. So that was a big deal. And like, but they took the stage, they obviously did not have a full set. Not too many people did. Even like Eddie Vedder did like some acoustic stuff up there at a certain point. He did like, I don't know, 10 minutes or something. But like, yeah, they came out, they did patriotism, left, right, the whole fucking, 25,000 people left, right. Like they did it because even though they didn't know the song per se, I mean, some people probably did because Ralph Nader was running a pretty youth driven campaign, but it was obviously an easy song to do as a
Right.
as a fan to pick up on. I mean, it was an easy song to pick up on, I should say. And
That
you know,
that was the question I asked because that's pretty interesting. That makes for pretty interesting bedfellows, especially at that time.
hmm,
Because Ralph Nader was like, for people that don't know, he was more of like an independent. Uh, uh, he ran his
yeah,
campaign more independently, and so like in that sense, I get it makes sense. But still, it's you have this like upper crust white guy that's running
yeah.
a
I mean, I
campaign
don't
that's
know. I don't know if Ralph Nader was up here going like this. You know what I'm
right,
saying? But like, but Ralph Nader was the Bernie Sanders of his time. That was to take it back. Like that was the Bush Gore election. That was 2000. Ralph Nader was getting support from the youth that wanted something different. And while I think there's a huge difference between even, and I knew this going into the election, there's a huge difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore. There wasn't enough of a difference for some people, and Ralph Nader filled that gap. He did a lot of things under the Carter administration that, like seatbelt laws that we still live with today. So he's an accomplished person. But I don't think there was ever a consideration of like, we're too real to be in a political convention. It was like, it was no, it was like, oh, they want us to play the garden. Like, yeah, they're gonna do it. Like, so, that's how, and the performance went good, and you know, they're amped, like Len got to spin in front of a stadium full of people, and Ellen Vast, came out. Elle obviously did the verses, and Vast did the ad libs, and was out there to help do the left, right. And I could still picture. I was on the side of the stage, so like the stage at the Garden, you're basically on the floor, you know, and then you're looking up at the entire, like basically like a horseshoe around you of people
Mhm.
all the way up. So I've been there as a fan for basketball and probably for concerts, but I was there. I've also been there in a former life. I was like a sports producer, so I've also been on the floor for like Big East tournaments and shit. But I was also there before any of that happened. I was there with, that was the first time I was probably ever in the Garden, even before I went to a basketball game as a fan or something. Like I was probably the first time I was in the Garden, I was probably in the pit, like doing this shit. And so that was a pretty cool experience. And yeah, so I was on the side of the stage by the steps, and just there watching, and like I, it's pretty amazing. I mean, I think back and I'm like, like a less mature person probably would have like bogarted their way onto the stage or some shit. You know what I mean? Like, but that wasn't in me, and like I think to some degree I was not in this case specifically, but overall in my time with Jokes and with Ozone, like I was still and still am at my core to this day, despite appearances, a shy person. But then I was a lot more so. And I had a lot of dedication to the music and what I wanted to do with it. But yeah, I don't know, man. It was amazing. It was, looking back on it now, I'm really glad that I had that opportunity to be there for something so special. And like I said, I mean, it was never really a conversation about like whether it was appropriate to be at a political rally. I mean, obviously, if it was a Bush rally, it would have been different. But um, but yeah, I mean, with that said, I don't know, I can't recall like ever hearing El talk about Ralph Nader that much beforehand. I mean, it's not like he was like a dedicated Nader supporter, but I think if he voted, he might have voted for Nader. Who knows? I mean, that would have been typical for people of our age group and mindset at the time, especially in New York, where everyone knew, even if you understood the implications of having a third party candidate in an election like that in New York, a lot of people are just like, who cares? It's not going to matter in New York. So that's the way people vote here. To this day, that's the way I hear people talk about how they vote for third party candidates in New York City or New York State, even. But yeah, it was a great time. I mean, you know, it's pretty amazing. But yeah, the Tom York thing stands out to me, as a big deal. And I think that was a kind of an aha moment for L and probably for Michi and even for Vass, even though it wasn't his song, and for Len certainly too, like where it was like, oh wow, we're having like a severe impact.
No, and to Tom York's credit, he to this day he still champions
Mm-hmm.
indie music and indie rap very heavily. So that's really cool. Like
Yeah.
that's not something that he did as just as a gesture. Like he
Yeah, no, you could tell he was sincere, just even in the interaction. I think L went and talked to him afterwards. I wasn't there for that, but yeah, I mean, it wasn't just like, oh, I liked whatever these guys did just now. It was like, oh, I can't believe these guys are here. I didn't know anybody else knew who they were. Big up. So like that, it was more that kind of vibe than the former. So, but yeah, shortly after that, was when Jooks really actually, began. The only other thing that I wanted to get into that we didn't yet is, and it actually fits now, the equipment itself. Um, most of Jooks's equipment that I worked on came from Ozone. At that time, it was ADATs. You know, it's funny. I came across like some video footage of me mixing at L's just last night and posted it to Instagram. And it's funny, like next to me is like a stack of 24 tracks of ADAT, and I can't even imagine like doing recording sessions now where like you're controlling ADATs, or even doing mix sessions where you have to repeatedly bring three tapes in sync back to a marker point just to do your job. So it was the old days, man. And like a lot of the this is for like the equipment nerds, but like the stuff that we had at Ozone, we had like legitimate Pultecs, like not plugins. We had like three Pultec EQs. We had a Tube Tech EQ. We had an Avalon preamp. We had LA2As, like compressors in there. And we had a bunch of effect stuff. And I thought it was normal to have that stuff in a rack, which it's not. And back then it was just like quality older equipment that people knew worked. Today it's like those, if you look those things up, those are like vintage pieces,
right.
that are really hard to get a hold of for any amount of money that is reasonable. And so all of that stuff I found out when Ozone closed, I had no idea was actually John Hancock's equipment. So John Hancock owned all of that vintage stuff and basically leased it to Ozone, or at least lent it out to Ozone. And then L bought everything else. He bought the board, which was a Mackie D8B. Um, Interesting board that maybe we'll talk a little bit further about in another episode or format or whatever. He bought the racks. He bought all like the multi effect gear, which is some of the stuff that I have today. I went back and rebought a lot of stuff that I used to use then. Like, so I'm looking at my rack now, but like, Digitech TSR 12, Yamaha Rev 7. Like these are just multi effects units that at the time were like undervalued and today are still a little bit undervalued, but gave us the sound that we had at Ozone and gave me the sound that I had at Chooks. And that's why some of the records in recent years, since I got an analog board here in the studio here, like maybe some of the records are sounding a little more fuller and a little more like what I used to do back in the days because now I have some of that equipment back again, which I didn't have the ability to do for a long time. But yeah, I mean, L bought all that stuff, with I presume like whatever label advance that he had gotten to start Jokes from Caroline, like a lot of that got invested into building the studio out. And yeah, and the rest of it went back to John, went back to Hancock. And I think some of that stuff got moved in and out when I wasn't around. I don't you would think that me and my role that I would actually be the one moving that. I think I helped take it apart. I actually took some of that stuff too. I had a Hughes phaser. It was my secret weapon for decades. It finally broke recently. It just stopped working, but it was kind of like more of like a consumer prosumer level piece that people would put in their stereo collection to kind of widen out like a stereo mix in their audio file room or whatever. And I used to use it to just straight face stuff because that's what Vassal's taught me to do with it. He loved it because he was like, "Oh, airline pilots use this to fucking phase out noise when they're flying." Like Hughes makes the same equipment, and he would bug off of it. But so I had that. I took a rack that I got rid of. I still have a red MIDI cable to this day. This is really getting into nerd territory here, but I have this red MIDI cable right here that is still being used. That definitely came from Ozone, and I remember it because it's red. But so I don't know. That's how much it meant to me at the time, and that's sort of the story of the equipment part of it. Once we got set up at L's, I helped set that studio up, plugged everything in, replicated what we had at Ozone, and the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, that's dope. That you were able to kind of carry that lineage over to the next studio.
We'll get another episode going in the next month or two. And there'll be clips floating around. Make sure you share the content. Um, you know, I think a big part of this show is just to kind of put down a little bit of a historical record into some final details, of some finer details of things that went down back in the day in sessions and musical choices and mixes and just to wonk out on that because not enough people really go into enough detail on these indie classics and everything that came out that really deserves a lot more love than sometimes it gets. So big up to all the people that really are invested in this series, but also into like Ozone and Jokes as well. Because I think it's worth talking about all that, and we can get into some other aspects of the scene at some point too.